one thing that I was really excited about with the Pfizer program is that it addresses what I see as two major gaps, one of which I think there's quite a bit of focus on, and one of which I think sometimes gets less focus to the detriment of sort of EDI initiatives overall. So with the Pfizer gift, we were able to, at the same time, support the representation of individuals from underrepresented groups in vaccinology, while also supporting science focused on addressing vaccination issues that were specific to vulnerable populations. And I think sometimes the easy thing to do is focus on, or the more obvious thing to do, I'm not sure, is sort of focus on the representation piece, which is critically important, but then we don't always, in my view, sort of like close the circle and make sure that our like research missions actually address these issues too. And so I think that was one of the things that, you know, I was most enthusiastic about with the Pfizer gift.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think, you know, that was an amazing initiative in the way of writing in equity, right? Vaccine equity into research, into innovation, into manufacturing, so that you are producing and training, right? Training and mentoring a new group of racialized scholars and researchers who can go into those communities, find out, you know, what the gaps are, and then report back to the larger community to say, well, here are the gaps in research. This is perhaps a way to reach out to these communities versus these communities, and maybe we need to, you know, not rethink the science, but rethink the delivery and
Absolutely.
the access, right?
Yeah, I know our colleague Sonia Anand has done a lot of work recently sort of talking about the lack of representation of underrepresented groups in things like early phase clinical trials, but that also extends to, I think, like the discovery and development phase of a lot of drugs and diagnostics. And you know, of course it's understandable if you don't see yourself or your community involved in the sort of like creation and development of these things, anyone would be mistrustful or
Because it seems to
questioning
be
of them.
pushed from outside
Exactly.
rather than something that is developed from within the community in conversation with the community.
Exactly.
And therefore has the best interests of the community
in
right?
mind, yeah.
So you don't have to rebuild trust. Trust is then written into vaccine research and manufacturing. So,
Great.
is that okay?
Yeah. This is awesome. Maybe chat with each other about the role of humanities in healthcare research and why it's been important, because I know Claudia Emerson is also part of Nexus,
Yes.
and why it's important to have researchers from these two apparently very different disciplines, how they work together and how they complement each other. So I guess, Matt, maybe talk to Chandram about you know, the synergies that you see between.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think one of the things that has started to change and needs to continue to change in sort of the biomedical sciences is that where we often start when we're thinking about, you know, coming up with some new innovation for a disease is so far away from the end user that we forget to build the end user into the early phase of development, right? Like often we'll start out, you know, screening drugs in a high throughput screen with cells and plates and looking at whether the drug kills those cells or doesn't, and it's so far away from the implementation phase of what that would actually look like were it to turn into a therapy that it causes a whole bunch of inefficiencies, and it unintentionally builds in inequities because we don't always have diverse voices represented in that process. And you know, as we've discussed, it doesn't matter whether you have the best drug in the world for something if no one will take it. And so I think you know, especially biomedical scientists who work on the sort of basic side of, you know, developing new drugs or diagnostics or innovations and are less sort of patient facing or community facing, we can't ignore even from this sort of conceptual phase of our process, what the realities of what we're doing will look like for different communities. And I think a lot of times we forget how practically important this is. Like, I think we think like, oh, that's not our job. Our job's to get the drug designed and let other people worry about getting it out into communities. But there are simple things that can cause huge problems. For example, something as simple as how a drug is administered, right? There are all kinds of communities who may strongly prefer not to have a substance injected, but would be happy to take it orally. That's fundamentally a biomedical problem that needs to be considered at the outset. And there are examples of this. I'm not sure the example that's coming to mind initially is an example that was specific to a marginalized community. But there was several years ago an initiative to make, I think, insulin in an orally available formulation, so that people wouldn't have to like inject insulin all the time because, you know, it's painful and uncomfortable given the frequency. But the delivery device was this like big bulky thing that nobody wanted to carry with them and use, and that got all the way approved to marketed, and then didn't sell, and they had to pull it completely. But it just goes to show how these things that I think sometimes biomedical scientists forget about, the practical realities of how the trajectory of something that can start really, really early can ultimately lead to suboptimal benefit of a new innovation, because those concepts aren't necessarily built into the way they're trained. And that's where I really see the value of having these sorts of, you know, multidisciplinary perspectives brought to bear on thinking about health, you know, at all phases of this sort of continuum.
In terms of, you know, humanities researchers, of course we can't make vaccines like you can, but we can ensure optimal uptake of vaccines, right? We can ensure that the communication reaches your target, you know, audience. We can ensure that you have a better understanding of the context, right? What are the assumptions or perceptions around illness, around health, right? Around disease in particular communities. As you just said, some people would prefer an oral medication rather than, you know, injecting something. So, you know, what works for particular groups based on age, based on race, based on, you know, communities that, you know, other communities that they come from. And I think, you know, with humanities researchers, given that many of us work in such interdisciplinary fields, right? You know, gender studies, critical race studies, disability studies, etc. So we bring a multidisciplinary perspective to begin with. Doesn't matter which department or particular field we might be identified with. So we already have this larger, broader, holistic concept, you know, in our mind. So we don't start with just a small question, but always in the context, right? So we are always aware about the context, right? Histories and languages and culture and assumptions, etc. So that always allows us to start with a very complex kind of a plate rather than your cell example. So you're starting with the cell but not quite thinking of the human. We start with the differences in the human. And that, you know, so it's a very different starting point.
Yes, for
right?
sure.
So the moment we start a question, it's like, yes, it's human, but that human is situated in a place, grew up in a particular context, in a particular family, particular upbringing, so the outcomes will not be the same, whether it's health, whether it's education, right? Class, gender, race, you know, geography, all determining the pathways that they take. So we start with that diversity, right? We start that, you know, people are different, cultures are different. So how do we work with that difference, right? They don't have to agree, but how do we work with that difference, and how do we understand and nuance that difference so that we meet people where they are? So I think that's where humanities researchers can come in, right? Like they can't improve the science, but they can improve the context in which the science is working. They can make sure that there is better communication. They can make sure that, you know, that trust is rebuilt, you know, particularly with, you know, again, I'm thinking of COVID, the misinformation, right? That we saw. So there's a lot of distrust in terms of science and scientists, and I think humanities scholars can come in and repair that trust. So not
Right.
just in terms of vaccine, but science in general, I would say.